Resume. Hi, Ming. Thank you for joining us. All right, well, I'm going to go ahead and begin since we are at noon. I just wanted to introduce myself. I'm Sandra Charlotta. I'm the Assistant Director of Administration for CM2, Cooperative Mobility for Competitive Megaregions. Today we have with us Ed, is it Pettitt? I'm sorry, Pettitt or Pettitt?
Yes, Pettitt.
Pettitt, I'm sorry, I should have asked before we begun how you like to pronounce it. Ed Pettitt with TSU, who will be doing his presentation today. Generally our brown bags, we have about usually 2 guests, but this month we have 1 guest, and it's about a 20-minute presentation with 10 minutes for Q&A. So as I said, I will introduce Ed and his presentation, and then after he presents, we'll have a short Q&A to discuss the details of what he's presented. His presentation title is A Mirage in the Desert, a spatial network analysis of supermarket expansion as a mitigator of food insecurity in a formerly redlined neighborhood, which sounds like a really interesting topic. I know that food deserts and even, it can often be related to transportation issues for a lot of cities, especially larger cities. I lived in Washington, D.C., and that was a huge city that had a lot of food deserts and transportation deserts for certain neighborhoods, or transportation access, I should say. So I'm very interested to watch your presentation, and I'll probably have a few questions myself. So without further ado, I'll just go ahead and let Ed take over with his presentation, and we can begin. Ed, please.
Great. So I think you'll need to unshare, and then I will reshare mine. And while I'm doing that, let me just qualify this by saying I am a second-year PhD student at Texas Southern University in the Department of Urban Planning and Environmental Policy. A transportation planner specifically. My co-author Wilson is in the transportation track. He wasn't able to join us today, but I would love your feedback, not just questions, but your advice on how actually to do further research on this and expand our study to explore some of the more transport-related elements. So I did this as part of an introductory GIS class. So this was my first network analysis in GIS. So just wanted to put that out there. So I'm open to all kinds of feedback, suggestions, recommendations, future study tracks, and I hope that maybe one day we can beef this up and publish it. But for now, what I've done is I've created a story map, because I've also, I got into urban planning because I'm a community organizer and activist in an inner city neighborhood in Houston called Third Ward. And I was seeing all of these, my background's in public health, and I was seeing all these issues with, the social determinants of health that were tied to the built environment and the natural environment, and they weren't being addressed by healthcare per se. But I was seeing, some movement in some of these things being addressed through better planning of walkable neighborhoods, through the Mayor's Complete Communities initiative, and through some of the work of professors at the Urban Planning Department at TSU. And that's how I got connected with them and decided to go back for my PhD in this. So I'm really interested in the intersection of public health, the built environment, and the natural environment. And so I think some of that will come through during the presentation. So as it was mentioned, the title is A Mirage in the Desert. And I will put the link and share this again in the chat, and we'll also share it so it can be put on your website. I really want this to be used, by community members as well. So I've kind of combined some of the more technical aspects with some narrative to help explain it to a lay audience. And I start with a history of the neighborhood. So when Houston was incorporated in 1837, it was originally divided into 4 wards in a grid. And so the southeast quadrant of that grid is known as Third Ward. After the Civil War, a large number of formerly enslaved African Americans from East Texas and Louisiana settled in Third Ward and other kind of working class neighborhoods near Houston's downtown. And Third Ward eventually became the economic and cultural hub of the Black community in Houston. And actually, my mentor, Dr. Robert Bullard, spoke a lot about this in his book, Invisible Houston. One of the center points of the neighborhood is Emancipation Park, which was initially developed to celebrate Juneteenth, which has now become a national holiday. And the neighborhood is now being considered as part of a national emancipation trail. Despite being home to a number of prominent African-American leaders over the years, and one of the largest HBCUs where I study, Texas Southern University, Third Ward has also suffered from a history of disinvestment and environmental injustice. In the early 1930s, in the aftermath of the Great Depression, the Homeowners Loan Corporation was developed, and they were charged with issuing federally backed home mortgage loans on behalf of the federal government. And what they did is they sent out appraisers to create residential security maps for hundreds of US cities, including Houston. And they rated the investment potential of each neighborhood in these cities on a scale from A being best to D being hazardous. Neighborhoods that were predominantly Black, Hispanic, or comprising of foreign-born immigrants were given a D rating and outlined in red. And that's where we get the term redlining. And this is an actual map from the 1930s of the Holk appraisers' jurisdictions in Houston. At the same time, many neighborhoods were enacting deed restrictions that prevented non-white residents from moving to or purchasing property within their boundaries. So you can see this is from a deed restriction in a neighborhood in Houston, which has since the Supreme Court rulings in the late 1940s have been ruled unconstitutional, but the wording originally would say the premises herein described shall never be sold, conveyed, or demised to any person except of the Caucasian race. And so the neighborhoods with these restrictions in place in the 1930s and 1940s were deemed by Holk appraisers to be protected from any kind of influx of people of color, and therefore these neighborhoods were given the green rating of the best investment opportunity. So this is zoomed in, showing the red line section of Third Ward, and it's bounded by Dowling Street, which has just in the past few years been renamed Emancipation Avenue, Hutchins Street, Leland Street, Cullen Boulevard over by the University of Houston. And so this neighborhood, actually I'm presenting from this neighborhood today, this is where I live, this was historically redlined. One of the interesting things, if you look in the bottom left-hand corner, you'll see a street called Alabama. And you'll see that one side of that street is red, the other side is green. There's no gradation. If you remember from the ratings, you can go from green being best to blue being second best to yellow being declining or caution to red being hazardous, don't invest here. But there's no gradation between the two sides of Alabama Street. That's because this was purely based on race and the racial covenants. So the south side of Alabama Street had a racial covenant that there could be no non-Caucasians moving into that neighborhood. And so therefore, one side of the street was deemed a best investment for the federal government mortgage lenders, and the other side of the street was a hazardous investment. And so it wasn't based on housing stock or environmental considerations. Literally one side of the street could be red, the other side could be green. And even to this day, if you drive down Alabama Street, you can see the disparate investment that has occurred on both sides of that street. Historically, Third Ward was home to a variety of corner grocery markets, and many of them historically had full deli and produce section. They were community grocery stores. But a lot of these disappeared when the owners and the wealthier customers left the neighborhood. And this was due to many different forms of disinvestment. One of them was the eminent domain demolitions during urban renewal, when you had interstate highway construction coming through Third Ward. And we actually have two highways that were built through the neighborhood: the Gulf Freeway, which divided the neighborhood north and south, and then 288 and I-45, which divides the neighborhood east and west. And as you all know, as transport planners, this kind of demolition and highway construction divided Black and brown inner city neighborhoods throughout the US. And so it really hastened the exodus of residents and businesses who saw that these neighborhoods were being bypassed to connect the suburbs to downtown, and the residents and businesses who could afford to move out moved out to the suburbs. And so what remained behind was a downward spiral. In the 1980s, you had a crack epidemic. Third world residents had to rely on the energy dense and nutrient poor junk food that remained in the remaining corner stores and gas stations and fast food vendors. And to this day, third world residents experience food insecurity at a rate 125% higher than the national average. We also have a practice that, even though mortgage redlining is technically and legally, unconstitutional and outlawed, even though we have a lot of real estate issues that create disparate racial impacts, you have something called supermarket redlining, which is still openly done today. And this refers to the practice of large supermarkets deliberately avoiding low-income inner-city communities of color for their store locations or relocating their stores from these neighborhoods to the suburbs. And the supermarkets justify this geographic discrimination by citing low profit margins and higher crime rates. But due to this kind of legal supermarket redlining, low-income communities of color in the inner cities have less access to fresh produce and often pay higher prices for lower quality and less nutritious food options. And in the background, you can see this map of Atlanta. And if you look in the historically redlined areas, to this day, all you see are the orange dots showing convenience stores and gas stations. All the yellow dots, the full service supermarkets with fresh produce, deli sections, those are all outside of the redlined areas, even to this day. So we still, even though we don't have mortgage redlining, we have supermarket redlining. In the past few decades, the residents of Houston's third world neighborhood have seen their neighborhood grocery stores go out of business. Some have converted to nightclubs. Some are sitting vacant. And one of the reasons I like doing this story map is that you can really show before and after. So this is Millard's Food Market in 2019. And just a couple years later, it's now replaced by a nightclub. Here's James Food Market in 2015. Now it's abandoned. This is the Quality Food Market in 2010. Now it's abandoned. A lot of them are being torn down and built up in luxury townhomes, which is great for the folks moving into these and who can afford these luxury townhomes when they often come with a vehicle. But for the many of the residents who remain in the neighborhood, primarily renters working class jobs, they rely on public transport and foot and bike and other ways to get to their food. So it's not as easy for them to lose these neighborhood options and drive a couple miles to the nearest grocery store. Despite the protests of local residents a few years ago, another empty lot was converted into a Burger King Popeyes gas station combo. And so the residents protested this because they did not want more fast food restaurants. They wanted a proper grocery store in the neighborhood. But the protests were to no avail. So now we have, all of our corner stores, which themselves weren't ideal, but at least they were something. They're closing down, and we're getting Burger Kings and gas stations in their place, servicing the newer residents moving into the townhomes. So if you look at, that's the situation with the corner stores. If you look at the supermarkets, the chain stores, there were a number of changes, particularly the year from 2019 to 2020. So in November of 2019, a Whole Foods opened on Elgin. Now, all of these supermarkets, I should say, are outside of that redlined area. But these are the closest grocery stores to the Third Ward neighborhood. So in November 2019, Whole Foods Market opened up just outside the neighborhood. In December, an HEB, which was kind of the primary shopping place for folks in this neighborhood who could reach it through public transport. This particular one was on the bus line or their own vehicle. It closed, and the next day, the new location opened, which I'll mention a little bit later, was a similar distance, but not on a public bus line. And I'll explain kind of the politics around that decision to create the new location. Another kind of lower cost affordable option was the Fiesta, and that closed the following year. And I'll explain more about the Fiesta as well. So the opening of the new HEB grocery store at the intersection of North McGregor and State Highway 288, it was actually touted by the mayor, Sylvester Turner, and our local District D Council member, Dwight Boykins, as a solution to Third Ward's food desert problem. This was the language they used in their press releases. And the property for the store was actually purchased by the city with soon to expire federal economic development initiative funding that was meant to address food desert situations, and leased to HEB through a nonprofit as a way to entice HEB to build the new store. However, the property that the city selected and leased to HEB isn't actually in a food insecure census tract. Is actually just across the highway from the wealthy Museum District neighborhood, and in a section that is not deemed food insecure by the USDA or any other measure. So, so which are the sections that are considered food desert? There's actually 6 census tracts that are designated as food insecure due to low income and limited supermarket access as defined by the US Department of Agriculture. And so what we did is we used GIS network analysis to calculate driving distances from the different residential blocks to the nearest grocery stores. And we also created 1-mile service delivery boundaries for each supermarket. And we looked at the changes in the landscape from 2019 to 2020 based on those stores closing and opening. So the following map shows 1-mile travel distance service area for the chain grocery stores in Third Ward. And so before the closures and openings, and then after. So, even visually, without having to do complex statistical analyses, you can see that before the loss of the old HEB and the Fiesta, and after the addition of the new HEB and Whole Foods, there was actually more overlap of the service delivery areas of those stores in the Redline neighborhood or in the food desert tracts than after. So even though all these changes were touted by the mayor and the council member as improving access in the food desert, and they used federal tax dollars to do so, the situation actually got worse. And so we kind of look at this in a few more ways. So this map shows the percentage of households without a vehicle for the 6 census tracts in deemed a food desert in Third Ward versus the surrounding census tracts adjacent to the food desert where the actual stores are located. So in the actual food insecure tracts, almost 1/3 of the households do not have a vehicle. If you look at the census tracts where the stores are actually located, only 11% don't have a vehicle. So the supermarkets are actually located in the census tracts where residents already have easier access because of vehicle access. And where the supermarkets, where the residents would really benefit most from a closer proximity, where they don't have a vehicle, there are no supermarkets. The next map shows the driving distances from the residential intersections in the food insecure tracts to the nearest grocery stores. And so the green dots signify travel distances of less than 1 mile from the nearest supermarket. The yellow dots signify travel distances between 1 and 1.5 miles. And the red dots signify travel distances of 1.5 miles or more from the nearest supermarket. And there's the blue census tracts actually are also considered food insecure when you consider the low income census data where more than 100 housing units do not have a vehicle. So there's an additional kind of census tract that's deemed food insecure when you consider lack of access to a vehicle. But even with that, the supermarket census tract where the new HEB is located is still not in a food insecure tract, even when you consider vehicle access. So whether you're considering income or vehicle access, they built the new HEB in a tract that was not food insecure. So what you can see with this slider is that the area that benefited, that got more green dots, that went from red and yellow to green, is that neighborhood where the HEB was built that's not considered food insecure. If you look at that kind of island of red in the middle, where the food insecure tracts are in Third Ward, you'll see that the situation actually worsened for them. Not only because you lost the old HEB and the Fiesta, but you also have to consider that the new HEB is not on a public transit line, whereas the former one was. But this is just looking at driving distances. The next map shows the travel distances before and after 2019 to 2020 within the third ward census tracts specifically. And again, you just see that the island of red in the formerly Redline neighborhood just grows before and after. And the census tracts that benefited are census tracts that, number one, are outside the boundaries of the third ward, but number two, are not in food insecure census tracts. This shows that same data overlaid with the historic redlining. So we created a shapefile with the redlining designations, red being hazardous, yellow being declining, blue being kind of second best, and then green being best investment. And you can see that before the changes, most of the red dots were in the formerly redlined area of third ward. And after the changes, it's still the same. And you actually have more red dots in the formerly redlined neighborhood of third ward. Which neighborhood improved? The green line neighborhood, the neighborhood that in the 1930s and 1940s was deemed a best investment risk for the federal government for mortgages and other loans, still to this day is receiving those ancillary benefits. And it's that green line neighborhood that saw the most improvement from the new HEB, which again was built with federal tax dollars meant to help food insecure census tracts. I want to also focus in on the Fiesta, because the Fiesta has its own political controversy. So that building, that grocery store, was actually owned by Rice University through their investment arm called Rice Management Company. And they were leasing that property Fiesta until they decided that this neighborhood, now that it started gentrifying, is actually, they want to convert their real estate property into high-tech incubator accelerator space. So they converted the Fiesta grocery store that the residents in that neighborhood relied on to Greentown Labs, which is a green tech startup incubator and accelerator program. And it's great that we're focusing on renewable energy, but you have to look at the balance of the benefits of this decision and who's getting those benefits, and looking at the negative impacts of this change of ownership and usage, and who is getting the balance of those harms. So if you look at the benefits of the balance and harms, it's the new tech companies that are being recruited from Silicon Valley to move into this neighborhood and to rent from Rice that are getting the benefits. And it's the residents of Third Ward, the primarily African-American renting neighborhood residents, that now lost their access to affordable produce. And it's kind of, I guess, not surprising, but still disappointing that a university that preaches about social justice and equity in the classroom ignores those concepts when it comes to their own investment decisions. The closing of the Fiesta was not just surprising to the neighbors that shopped there and lived near there. It was also a shock and surprise to our current council member, Dr. Carolyn Evans-Shabazz, who took over from Dwight Boykins. And I'm going to try to show this video. If it lags or anything, you'll be able to watch it from the link, but I'm going to try to play a little bit because she addresses also the transportation issue.
And welcome back to The Factor Uncensored. Well, it doesn't matter which city you go to in this country, there are urban areas where they're facing a shortage of grocery stores. And they call that food deserts, where there are not fresh fruits and vegetables being sold to those who live in the community. Houston is no different. We have the problem here. Council member, I think it was back in July that it was announced, and eventually Fiesta here in Midtown at the edge of Third Ward shut down. What are the residents who don't have transportation doing?
Well, actually, as I was explaining, I didn't know they were closing this store, right? Because I thought that a part of the agreement was that the Ion was going to open, but they were going to keep the store. And so what has happened people are going to the HEB, and initially the HEB provided transportation. And so I guess they're going to have to catch the bus, which is not good because it's very difficult to do that. And so there are some other stores in the area, hopefully, that people can access, that they don't have to take to the public transportation. I mean, because we do have right down the street, we have Randall's, which we, can be a little pricey. And then we do have the HEB, as I mentioned. And then over on the Scott corridor, we have Pie Burns. Now, another tragedy, of course, was the loss of gyms, which burned down a couple of weeks ago.
So she mentions public transport, and let me just give some more background. The old HEB that was closed down was on a very convenient public transport line, the 54 route, that third world residents would use to get from downtown and do their grocery shopping. The new HEB, when it was built, was not near any public transport or bus route. And so in the beginning, when they opened, they provided shuttles. That's what she was mentioning, that the HEB was providing transportation. They provided shuttles. Eventually, they stopped doing the shuttles. And now they have like this kind of connector line that you have to go outside of the neighborhood to another public transit kind of hub station and catch a connecting line to that HEB. For some residents, it can be an hour to go that route or more. And so there was a big disparate impact of closing that old HEB and the new one in terms of public transport access. So I'm going to kind of move through rather quickly for the other side so we have some time for questions and answers. But things were compounded by the COVID pandemic in terms of food insecurity in the neighborhood. And I created this map that you can go through on your own leisure that shows you some of the locations of these abandoned corner stores and some of the food pantries and markets that were set up in their place to kind of mitigate this loss of food options. So this kind of shows you like the landscape of food insecurity in Third Ward in a very kind of spatial graphic sense. We do have some urban gardens like Blodgett Urban Gardens that's working with Texas Southern University to provide fresh produce. We also have a local nonprofit called Project Row Houses, and they've partnered with Urban Harvest Mobile Markets and Second Servings Houston's to provide both fresh produce in a mobile market setting, as well as prepared meals. And so, since these chain grocery stores aren't meeting the needs, we're having to be creative and look for investments in more community, local solutions to some of these issues. And so in summary, our spatial analysis found that drive times and service area coverage in Third Ward were actually not improved by the recent addition of the new chain supermarkets on the outskirts of the neighborhood. And actually any potential gains were offset by the closing of the more affordable supermarkets closer to the food insecure census tracts or on the public transport lines. So our results indicate that expanding the footprint of supermarkets alone, particularly in formerly redlined and disinvested urban neighborhoods, even when they're using federal dollars meant to mitigate food insecurity, really are not sufficient to improve the food desert situation. So, while these federal tax incentives may lure supermarkets into closer to lower income city neighborhoods, we also need to look at local initiatives that can have a stronger and more immediate impact, such as mobile farmer markets, community gardens, pantries, independent grocery stores, cooperatives, and also affordable online grocery delivery systems. You can also look at community fridges and maybe expanding selections of fresh produce and healthy food options in the existing and remaining corner stores and gas stations. But really, such local efforts would not only provide greater access to healthier food options, but they would also promote greater community cohesions and economic resiliency, because you can't rely on the big chain stores to address the real needs of the community that have the most needs. So thank you very much. That's my presentation. I'm happy to take any feedback, questions, comments.
Well, thank you so much. That was really such a really great lesson, an overview lesson of the history of the Third Ward, and something, it's really great when we get to focus on a specific area that people know, have, visited, as a Texan going into Houston and seeing different neighborhoods and being there. And then realizing, of course, that this is a national issue as well for a lot of cities, especially large major cities with large Black populations and immigrant populations as well. So thank you for sharing a really interesting topic. I guess I did want to ask a little bit about, you said that you worked with your partner or your research partner on this project. Can you talk about like when your research, like when you guys focused on your research time before you do these presentations?
When we focus on what? Sorry, could you repeat that?
When you actually were like doing the research, looking at this before actually, I guess you made this website and did the presentations themselves. When was your research period?
So we actually did this research as a class assignment with Dr. Chun, who's our GIS professor specialist at TSU, in a class over last summer, so summer of 2021. And this was an issue that was kind of a mutual concern to myself and to Wilson. And, you know, with his kind of interest in transportation and my interest in environmental justice and community organizing, we kind of looked at how we can use spatial network analysis and looking at drive times and looking at census data related to access to vehicle ownership and how that applied to the food desert situation. And, you know, I was particularly wanting to study what is the impact of this new grocery store they built, because people just took the politicians' words at face value that, oh, we just fixed the food desert problem in Third Ward by building this new HEB. So, you know, that's a great use of those tax dollars. We fixed the situation. And, you know, as someone who lives in the neighborhood, I could tell kind of experientially that the new grocery store wasn't really more accessible than the one it replaced. And things actually got more difficult when the Fiesta closed. But this actually provided like data and visuals to back that up. And I think this is going to make people hold their elected representatives more accountable to how they're spending their tax dollars. And if you're going to use tax dollars meant to solve food insecurity, you should probably use that funding in the neighborhoods that are food insecure, not in the neighborhoods that already have benefited from the green lining and in previous investments. So so we conducted this research last summer. I can still see other kind of future ways to expand it. You know, some of this is limited by our own kind of novice use of GIS, but there's got to be a way to do a network analysis using public transport times, because what we did was just general drive times from the intersections, as if people were using a personal car. But I would like to do another layer of analysis that's using public transport drive times and plug that into a GIS network analysis.
Right, yeah, absolutely.
Ed, if I
Yes.
may chime in here, thank you for your presentation, for sharing the historical story about Houston, and then the some background information and forces behind the formation and continuation of food desert, and a very interesting topic to explore. I have one question, and that question may be entirely out of context or whatever. If you feel unreasonable, then just ignore that.
No problem.
I was wondering, given now very much increased online shopping and then delivery, whether or not this kind of the new online business, the growth of such business can, whether or not it has helped a little bit or potentially could be tapped into to address the food desert problems.
So that's a very interesting question. And actually a previous graduate of TSU, and this was a few years ago, before the pandemic, before all of these changes I mentioned, she studied resident attitudes towards online grocery delivery in Third Ward, in this neighborhood. And she found that there was actually a high receptivity to using online delivery services in the neighborhood, which was maybe counterintuitive to some folks that thought that, poor neighborhoods wouldn't have access to mobile apps and things like that. But she found that there was a high usage, of smartphones and people using apps and wanting to use delivery services. And another interesting thing is that when I moved into the neighborhood 11 years ago, we had online app redlining in Third Ward. You couldn't use Uber Eats. You couldn't use, Instacart. You could use them like outside the neighborhood, but if you looked at their delivery maps, they like specifically carved their delivery areas around the neighborhood. That has changed. And I think it had already started changing when she did her research, but she found that people used it, wanted to use it. And I'm sure that's even more so now since the pandemic, and more so now since it's getting more difficult to drive to the newer grocery stores. So I think we should do some follow-up research looking at that. And maybe instead of spending millions of dollars of federal tax dollars to help HEB build a new grocery store, maybe we subsidize some of the online delivery services for folks in these neighborhoods, for folks in the food desert designated census tracts. So I think that there's a lot of potential there.
Yeah, great. Yeah, then kind of building some kind of public-private partnership, right?
Right. Just like we have SNAP benefits for folks that can reach a physical grocery store, we should have a version of SNAP to subsidize online delivery of fresh produce.
Yeah. Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, if there are no more questions, I'll just go ahead and say thank you again so much, Ed, for your time and presentation. It was really great to have this story map presentation. Generally, we have most people do a PowerPoint presentation, but it's actually really great to see the interactive maps and really, especially for people who have this particular interest of the neighborhood, to be able to check it out. So we're going to be really excited to share this link on our website and social media posts so that people can check this out and review your presentation on their own time and really dig into kind of the really great topic that you have started that people can, touch on. And as we talked about, like all the other opportunities that this research can be expanded on would be great.
Thank you so much. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you. So I am actually just wanted to share for, let me see if I can bring it up. Just to go ahead and note that our partners, TSU, it's two different departments that work with CM2. They are actually having a workshop on March 31st. They will be working with Houston, I'm sorry, I always get it wrong, the Houston Galveston Area Council organization for a workshop focusing actually on the Texas Triangle Megaregions to help with, to talk about rural communities within the Megaregion Triangle, Texas Triangle. So that'll be March 31st. We have the Zoom link available on our website for people who would like to sit in on this workshop that will be hosted by CTTR and HGAC. So again, March 31st at 1:30 p.m. Central Time, and that's with our TSU partners. So I just wanted to make that plug since that is happening next week with TSU. But then on that note, if there are no other questions, again, I'll go ahead and wrap it up and say thank you so much, Ed, for your time, your presentation. We really are so glad we had the opportunity to have these Zoom presentations where we get to reach out to our partners and have their students present their really fascinating research and really supplement what we're sharing with our CM2 audiences. So thank you all. Have a great afternoon, and we will see you for our next Brown Bag in April. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Take care.